whoever is registered here. Thank you for joining us. And gracias por estar con nosotros. Hoy tenemos un panel en vivo muy interesante. And I would like to just go ahead and introduce the panelists. And we're still waiting for one more that is joining and it's having a little trouble, but we will have it. So welcome. My name is Jorge Ferraez. I'm publisher of Latino Leaders Magazine and Líderes Mexicanos Magazine in Mexico City. And it is my privilege to have these fantastic panelists today with us to discuss a very interesting topic and business that is being brewing and is being quite commented and asked around in the recent years. And that is what is the environment? What are the opportunities? How can Mexicans invest in the U.S.? What is the new after COVID panorama? So many questions on this. And for that, we have, first of all, start ladies first. I would like to introduce Caroline Tang, which joins us from here in Dallas, Texas, where we are broadcasting these. She's partner for Ogletree, Dickens, Nash, Smoke, and Stewart, a very well-known law firm that has worldwide presence in Mexico City and here in the U.S. Caroline, thank you for joining us. Then I would like to introduce, well, Nora is not here yet, but I will still announce her. Nora Solano, who is a partner of KPMG in Mexico City from the offices of KPMG down there. Oh, she just joined. Nora, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Then I would like to continue with Jim Dolmes, also here from Dallas. Jim is Senior Research Advisor for the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. And then we have Luis Maisel from West Coast, from sunny San Diego. He is the founder of LM Advisors and a person who has a lot of experience in this field. Thank you, Luis, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And last but not least, of course, my good friend Jaime Palmer, Managing Director of View Capital Advisors, a very experienced firm here in Dallas in the topic of family offices and investments as well. Jaime, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Sure, yeah. Pleasure.
So as we promised, we are going for a protocol issue or topic. We are going to let Jim to make his presentation before, and he will make this presentation and he will take some questions if there's any before leaving the panel, and then leaving the other four panelists for later presentations and discussions. So thank you, Jim, again for joining us. Please go ahead, and I understand that we are going to know from you a little bit about how the panorama is now in the U.S. as we speak today, July, after COVID, after election year, many other factors that are very interesting for the U.S. economy.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel, and I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Can everybody see that? All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on with the U.S. economy and where it's headed over the next couple of years and in the longer run. So let me just start. I need to say at the beginning, though, just an obligatory disclaimer here that even though I'm from the Fed, the views I'm expressing here are my own. They don't necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve System. So let me kind of start with a bit about how we got here, how we got to where we are in here at the beginning of July with this economy subject to this pandemic. And we had, it's really this COVID shock in early March, where we had the mounting fears over the virus's spread, widespread social distancing, a lot of people sort of retreating from economic interactions, and leading to a really large drop in consumer spending, followed by we had very widespread declines in employment. And really, I mean, this is kind of the you know, the speed with which this happened is sort of the fastest moving contraction of this size in economic activity in a living memory. Certainly in any of the data that we have that goes back quite a ways. Um, you know, from mid-March, when things really started to go down till mid-April, it's likely, we don't measure real GDP or the economy's output at a monthly frequency, but if we did, it's kind of likely that it fell by about 12% over the course of that 1 month. Which, you know, if you put it in annualized terms, annualizes to a rate of decline of nearly 80%. And, you know, but then since late April, we've also seen kind of a fairly sharp rebound that began around late April, but, you know, from a very low base. So that the economy has kind of a very big hole to dig itself out of, even in kind of the best of circumstances. When you add to that the uncertainty over the course of the virus, the resurgence that we're seeing in a number of states, it's likely going to be a very long road to a full recovery. And just, you know, the sort of the speed with which this happened, where we had this contraction, we've already had this kind of sharp rebound begin, posed a lot of sort of challenges for us economists, just in terms of the limitations of the kind of traditional data we use, so that we had to turn to a lot of new kind of alternative high frequency data sources that we hadn't used before, but turned out to be very useful, where we could see things evolving over the course of weeks or even days. And let me just show you a couple to start with. And these are a couple that we actually constructed at the Dallas Fed. One, the one on the left, this is what we call the Mobility and Engagement Index. And this is kind of this is based on cell phone data, kind of measuring people's mobility, people's tendency to stay at home, how much they travel, how far they travel, how much time they spend away from home. And it's kind of normalized so that January, February is average 0, sort of normal mobility behavior. And you can just see kind of in mid-March, this sort of plunge that really, you know, there's a lot of more serious studies sort of showing this now, but one feature of this is this really plunged and kind of uniformly across the country. We have this sort of sliced up by states or by counties as well. This is the national version. But this mobility really collapsed kind of before there were any kind of restrictions in place, sort of orders that people had to stay at home or closing non-essential businesses or what have you. Just sort of, you know, voluntarily, sort of based on the fear of the spread of the virus. And you can see then sort of beginning around mid-April, it started to rebound, where to the point where now, and this is through last week, I think, it's about 40 percentage points below normal. The one on the right, so that's kind of the shock or sort of the impulse that hit the economy. The one on the right is kind of measuring, well, what happened? What did that impulse do? This is something we call the Weekly Economic Index. It's kind of a measure of economic activity on a weekly basis, drawing on a whole bunch of weekly sources that have to do with claims for unemployment, electricity consumption. We also look at tax receipts from states and localities and various measures of spending. And so we kind of aggregate this up into an index of economic activity, and it's basically scaled to be on a scale of a 4-quarter growth in GDP or the economy's output. So you see kind of up until mid-March, it's sort of cruising along around 2%, which the economy was growing just, you know, a touch under 2%. And then kind of close on the heels of that collapse in mobility, the weekly economic index plummeted to the point where it was 12% down by late April. But then at that point started to recover. And is now at minus 7.4%, which means kind of if you think if we measured GDP, the economy's activity on a weekly basis, this would say, you know, you're 7.4% below where you were 52 weeks ago, which is, you know, it's better than 12%. And that's a really sharp rebound that we've seen. but it's still, as I said, kind of a big hole for the economy to climb further out of.
Mm-hmm.
And one issue of kind of concern going forward is really going to be the labor market. Because this is sort of, we're in this situation where we have sort of this very clear kind of exogenous shock that has to do with the virus, a lot of people backing off from economic activity. And if everything got wrapped up really quickly, you could imagine all that activity coming back to normal very fast. But kind of the longer this goes on, the more you get into kind of traditional sort of recessionary dynamics. So that, kind of right now, a real high percentage of unemployed are just on temporary layoff so that they could return to employment very quickly. But, kind of the longer that mobility and people's engagement with the economy remains depressed, which is going to depend on the course of the virus and our ability to cope with it, those temporary layoffs start translating or transforming into permanent job separations. For example, your previous employer goes out of business, so you can't return to that job you had before. You have to go out and start searching. We know that that's kind of a time-consuming, costly process. It's costly on sort of both sides of the market, for employers to find workers, for workers to find employers, and leads to kind of long, dragged out recoveries. So if that happens, then we'd be in sort of a standard recovery from a standard recession, but starting from what could be sort of a very, very high level of unemployment and sort of a slow-paced recovery after that, like the recoveries from the last 3 recessions. So let me just show you kind of how just a couple snapshots of what's going on with employment, so you can sort of see what I'm saying. This is the unemployment rate. It was, sort of hitting these decades-long lows, under 4%, 3.5%, 3.6%, and then basically over the course of 2 months, March and April jumped up by 10 percentage points, 14.7%. It's come down quite a bit since then, come down to about 11%. Which is, kind of in the grand scheme of things, that is like a historically fast drop in the unemployment rate. But we kind of imagine, it's going to slow its rate of decline from here on out. Another way of looking at kind of what's going on with the labor market, because unemployment measures only captures people who are kind of in the labor force. If people are sort of moved to the sidelines, where they're sitting on the sidelines, they're not employed, but they're not looking for a job because, maybe there are concerns about the virus, that's kind of not going to be picked up in the unemployment rate. So another kind of way that's maybe more useful right now is to look at the ratio of employment to the population. Basically, just what fraction of the working age population has a job. And that was over 61%, and then in the space of a couple months fell down to nearly 50%. It's recovered somewhat since then, but again, there's still kind of a long way for it to go to recover. So then, kind of thinking about the outlook for 2020 and beyond, and I'm going to draw on kind of a couple sources here for talking about the outlook. For real GDP growth, sort of a measure of aggregate activity, and then for the unemployment rate, which is also going to be kind of critical. And I'll talk a bit, there are 2 lines for each of these in the table if you look. One is private forecasters. This is just a median of a bunch of forecasts from basically from big banks, investment firms. So it's Citi, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, all those people who publish forecasts on a regular basis. The other says FOMC projection. This is the FOMC, this is the policy-making body within the Federal Reserve. On a regular basis, they make projections about where they see GDP, the unemployment rate, going over the next several years, and also in the long run. And they last did this at their last meeting in June. Things have changed, as I said, the data are evolving very quickly. So even a projection made in June maybe if they were making it again today, they may say something different, but it's still, it's still somewhat in line with what private forecasters are saying near term. So it's not necessarily that stale. And what they see for 2020 is a decline in real GDP on a 4-quarter basis. So compared to, the end of 2019, we're going to finish 2020 with real GDP down 6.5%, which is a bit more pessimistic than the private forecasters who see a decline of a little less than 6%. But hand in hand with that is, ending this year, if you go down to the next 2 rows, ending this year with an unemployment rate that's likely to be above 9%. The FOMC projections for the Fed, 9.3% for the 4th quarter of this year. Private forecasters somewhat more pessimistic at 9.8%, which is, if you think about it, that's ending this year with an unemployment rate that's almost as bad as the worst unemployment rate we saw during the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis of 2008, 2009. So we're going to be ending the year with a sort of stepping off point that's almost as bad as the peak of the previous recession. But then, in 2021, we see kind of the expectation is for a sharp rebound. Both the FOMC and private forecasters seeing GDP growth of about 5% in 2021, and a rather significant drop in the unemployment rate of about 3 percentage points, which again, this is, these are really large movements. To kind of put that in perspective, after the Great Recession, right? When unemployment peaked at 10% in 2009, the rate at which it fell after that was about 0.6% per year on average, which meant it was a slow, gradual decline, which took a long time to get down to something that would really correspond to a tight labor market. So that if, coming out of this, if we ended this year with unemployment close to 10%, and still had that same kind of dynamic where it was all just the usual recessionary dynamics, and we expected a slow, gradual decline in unemployment, it would be something like 10 or 11 years until unemployment got back down to, 4% or so where we were before all this started. But, the presumption is that there is this exogenous COVID shock aspect to it, that when that dissipates, as that dissipates, there's going to be a much quicker rebound in economic activity than we would normally expect. The FOMC goes out to 2022 and their projections, 3.5% real GDP growth, which is still quite strong, unemployment rate down to 5.5%. And then in the longer run, so this is, beyond 5 to 10 years out, where really you think all sort of the cyclical stuff is played out, and we're kind of at the long run growth rate, long run unemployment rate for the economy. The presumption is we'll be at a rate of growth a touch less than 2%. That's sort of based on trends in productivity growth and trends in labor force growth, which we know are both relatively muted. And going along with that, an unemployment rate around 4.1%, which is, roughly just a touch higher than where we were toward the end of last year. So there's a lot of, I should emphasize, there are a lot of risks around the outlook. Because really everything is going to kind of hinges on the path that the virus takes. A lot of the forecasts that people make are scenario based, right? So I may have a forecast that says, well, assuming the virus doesn't pick up too much, people don't further disengage from the economy more than they have, and say by mid or late 2021, a vaccine becomes widely available, well, then here's my outlook. Yeah. I may have a very, yes?
No. I was just saying yes. I mean, you're right. In that sense, it's perception. Now, I want to ask you something. We know the economy, and the economy is also a game of perceptions. right?
Mhm.
And perceptions influence investors' activity and investors' confidence, and also influences consumer confidence. And
Mhm.
those two things are vital for any economy. And of course, I mean, the economy, the U.S. economy is still the strongest and the largest in the world. And so taking in account the perceptions factor, then there's another factor that is the world is not coming back to normal. I mean,
Mhm.
many industries are going to be very different from now on, like the restaurant, airlines, and
Mhm.
many others are going to be different. They will have to find their own, flow to keep functioning and keep, making money and operating. So aside from these, and just to wrap up your presentation, aside from these, do you see any other factor that we should include or we should consider for the foreseeable future in the U.S. economy? Something like, for example, China or any other global phenomenons or facts?
Well, I think there's it's likely. I mean, and this just sort of speaking for me, sort of my outlook is I think it's likely to we're likely to see kind of weak productivity growth for a while, because a lot of it has to do with some of the factors that you mentioned, that there's going to be you know there's going to be a lot of sort of reallocation or reorganization of the way some economic activity takes place, whether it's restaurants, whether it's leisure and hospitality. And that's potentially going to be a drag on aggregate productivity. But I think there's also going to be, given the nature of this shock, you can see kind of a tendency toward deglobalization, right? With economies becoming sort of in many ways cutting themselves off from other countries. And we know that, I mean, without completely evaluating the welfare consequences of trade or openness, one thing we do know that we're very confident of is that process of globalization enhances productivity, and going in the opposite is going to kind of slow that process down, which on top of you put that slower productivity growth on top of a labor force that just demographically is growing at a slower rate. Then there's kind of the outlook for aggregate output is quite soft and quite muted. And then kind of going along with that is sort of a secondary consequence of that, and this is maybe more relevant for the people in your group here today, is that it's likely to be accompanied by very low interest rates for the foreseeable future. I mean, we've seen this trend, and this trend has been going on for quite a while, toward lower and lower and lower interest rates. I believe even when we get past this, I mean, now we're in a position where the Fed has basically set its policy interest rate at 0, and has said it's going to keep it there for quite a while, or said it's likely to be there for quite a while in its last forecast. But kind of even looking beyond that, these forces of kind of slower growth, slower population growth, slower productivity growth also are going to kind of weigh on interest rates. We're going to be kind of in a permanently low interest rate environment, unless kind of unforeseen changes happen, right? Unless there's some sort of shock to productivity that would come as a surprise to all of us and be a pleasant one, right? But suddenly, some innovation or what have you comes online that leads to much more rapid growth. Apart from that, right now it looks like we're going to be in a kind of a low interest rate environment. That poses challenges for people investing. It also poses challenges for policymakers, because they're sort of, the Fed has kind of less room to maneuver, right, when interest rates are just kind of generally low. So it poses challenges for policy as well, and I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge.
All right. Okay. Well, I think we had a good panorama. I just want to ask if any of the panelists has any question for Jim before we let him go of the panel. And if not, well, I really want to thank you, Jim, for this presentation. Do you have something else to share with us?
No, other than, be safe, wear a mask, I think is good advice. There's
Yeah,
more, one of the sort of side effects of having to analyze all this is it's just being exposed to a lot of the research that comes out of the medicine epidemiology. And there are a lot of recent studies, more and more, just showing that if people would just wear masks, right, this thing would
yeah,
slow down quite a bit. So wear a mask and stay safe,
definitely.
I guess.
All right.
And then thank you for inviting me here today.
No,
Hey,
thank you.
Jorge, there is one question that is related to the Fed
Sure.
that's very interesting from Edson Murguia, which I don't know if Jim, if you caught the question, but the question is, from a technical point of view, should we be worried about the Fed's balance sheet? How long is it going to take the Feds to normalize?
Hmm. Uh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. You remember it was in the process of normalizing before all this started, and even at that point, it was sort of a very gradual process. Um, so, and I guess I wouldn't want to speculate on kind of where it's headed. Um, so, but I know that the Fed is sort of committed to using all its tools to fight this downturn. So, um, you know, we'll see what the future holds. I guess I'd rather just leave it at that. So,
All right.
I hope that's okay.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, of course.
Okay.
And well, thank you again, Jim, for participating. Thank you for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas to lend us your visions and your presence today. And again, thank you. And now you're free to dismiss if you want, and we will continue with the rest of the panelists.
Okay.
And
Well, thank you all.
thank you. And I will since we started already with a economic panorama and things like that, I would like to go to the investors that we have on the panel before going to the legal repercussions and also the fiscal or the tax-related repercussions. So, Luis, how do you see the panorama now? What kind of opportunities do you see? What kind of challenges do you see right now?
Thank you, Jorge. I would talk of two different levels. The public markets are on the fixed income side. The interest rates are horrible. They're very, very low. Investors that always think I want 8% in a very safe investment, that does not exist. So either you go into junk and you have a lot of junk that's getting smelly, a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of companies in trouble, or you go into the markets and the markets are totally separate in terms of Wall Street from Main Street. The market rebounded almost completely. The NASDAQ is at an all-time high. Amazon hit $1.5 trillion in value. Tesla, when Elon Musk said that it was going to get at 420 or there was going to be a private, taking it private at 420, everybody thought he was crazy. It's at 1300. So the markets, it's very tough to get into the market right now. I think there's a fear of missing out that's driving a lot of investment. Managers that want to play along with the benchmarks are buying when they believe, even though the profits are not there. It's an interesting time for private investments. And I think it's very important for the people you have in this panel, the family offices. The main reason to have a family office is not necessarily to buy out of ETFs out of the stock exchange. It's to look for opportunities to have a very mixed group of assets that form the wealth of the family or the families. And I think it's a very interesting time. Real estate has not yet suffered dramatically from COVID. A lot of people are waiting to see how many companies go under, how many commercial properties become available. But up to now, even though the banks have announced that there's a lot of late payments or no payments, there's nothing in the market at decent prices. Prices are holding well. Companies, you're starting to see need for liquidity. You saw a lot of companies, public companies, go out and place bonds and other sources of financing to survive through the pandemic. But you have a lot of private companies that are going to be needing money and are going to open up opportunities for wealthy investors. I think if I was in the shoes of the people in this panel right now, I would take a wait and see position, ready to jump in as soon as the opportunities start opening up. I don't think we have a defined picture right now. I think it's blurry. It's a little bit like when you move your camera and the picture does not come up very clear or very neat, but you know that behind it, there is going to be very interesting things to do. And I would like to stop there and open it up for questions because I think there should be a lot of questions.
Yeah. Now, Jaime, in that sense, Luis already touched the topic of the panorama and investors, and you and your company have worked for a long time with family offices as well. So why don't you explain to us what are the opportunities out there and what's the advantages between working on a family office or through a family office to make investments and maybe having your own or joining one that already exists, or maybe just go on a different formula.
Okay. Thank you, Jorge, for inviting me. I'm going to switch to Spanish.
Sí, claro.
Yo creo que reitero lo que comentó el señor Maisel, en el sentido de que inclusive desde antes de que empezó la pandemia, se viene dando un fenómeno en los mercados de capitales en Estados Unidos, en donde básicamente la concentración de capital está haciendo que se divida el mundo de oportunidades de inversión, en donde lo que está sucediendo es, hay demasiado capital y no suficientes oportunidades de capital que meritan la inversión. Repito, esto desde antes de la pandemia, ¿no? En donde estás viendo que hace 15 años había 30 empresas de private equity, de capital privado en Estados Unidos, que controlaban a lo mejor un 50% del capital de riesgo, y hoy en día tienes 5 o 6 que controlan el 70% de capital de riesgo. Digo, como ejemplo, puedes apuntar a un KKR, a un Carlyle, a un Blackstone, que vienen creciendo a pasos agigantados, en donde manejaban a lo mejor 30, 40 billones de dólares, y hoy están manejando 150, 500 billones de dólares. Y eso lo que nos ha llevado a concluir es que existe una laguna importante en donde el capital, dado el volumen de capital que estas gentes controlan, en donde no pueden participar, porque las inversiones son relativamente chicas para el monto de capital que tienen que destinar. Como bien dice el señor Maisel, eso crea una distinción muy importante en lo que son, vamos a decir, los mercados de capitales públicos y las oportunidades privadas. A tu pregunta específicamente, Jorge, yo te diría que la ventaja de tener un family office, y creo que la definición deja mucho que desear, porque hay de family office a family office. Y a lo que me refiero es, finalmente, la función de un family office, en nuestra opinión, debe ser aquella que se dedica a buscar colocar el capital de la familia en el mejor riesgo de acuerdo al rendimiento que están buscando. Y el error creo que mucha gente comete es buscan el rendimiento y después el riesgo, en donde lo que realmente el family office debe de hacer es administrar el riesgo de inversión. En Estados Unidos, tradicionalmente un family office que se dedica a ese papel, es decir, administrar el riesgo, el primer riesgo no es el financiero, normalmente es el fiscal y luego sigue el legal y por último es el financiero. Entonces, yo creo que la ventaja que existe en estar en un family office para invertir en Estados Unidos es, ya sea te unes a un family office que tenga las mejores prácticas para poder operar en el contexto y la idiosincrasia americana, que es muy diferente a la idiosincrasia mexicana, en donde hasta hace poco el tema fiscal en México, la verdad era secundario, sino que tercero. se está convirtiendo cada vez más en un tema de prioridad. Y el legal es un poco más laxo comparativamente hablando con lo que tienes en Estados Unidos. Entonces, la ventaja es que si te unes a un grupo que tiene mejores prácticas para administrar el riesgo en ese orden, en esa cronología, tu curva de aprendizaje es mucho más acotada, particularmente cuando estás entrando en inversiones privadas, porque ahí el tema fiscal y legal se convierte en prioridad. Te diría que invertir en real estate en Estados Unidos, a diferencia de muchos países, inclusive México, no es un tema de activo inmobiliario, es un tema de estructuración financiera y legal. Si tú te equivocas en la estructuración financiera o en la legal, en el tema inmobiliario en Estados Unidos, ya tu tesis financiera no va a funcionar. Entonces, yo creo que la ventaja sería primordialmente que la curva de aprendizaje te la puedes evitar cuando estás entrando en un mercado tan competitivo como es el de Estados Unidos y evitar cometer errores.
Okay.
Desde el punto... Perdón, y no, tú interrúmpeme, Jorge. Desde el punto de vista de oportunidades de inversión, nuestra tesis es relativamente muy sencilla. Nosotros buscamos activos duros, en donde tenemos un activo. Una simplificación sería el tema inmobiliario. Como bien dice el señor Maisel, ahorita aún no se ve reflejado una minusvalía en los activos, por ende no estamos viendo ese universo aún, pero estamos buscando otro tipo de activos que tienen un activo duro, un contrato de flujo de capital de largo plazo con una contraparte interesante. En donde en un mundo perfecto, si queremos ahora sí matar tres pájaros de una pedrada, como decimos en México, en donde tenemos un activo duro, un contrato de largo plazo a flujos, con una contraparte interesante, y el tercero es que no tenga una correlación con la economía. Entonces, un ejemplo muy sencillo de eso sería, por ejemplo, la infraestructura de agua en Estados Unidos. La infraestructura de agua, acabamos de terminar una transacción en donde estamos por concluir la construcción de un acueducto a la ciudad de San Antonio. Construimos un acueducto de 120 millas, le vamos a abastecer el 30% del agua a la ciudad de San Antonio con un contrato de 35 años, y nuestra contraparte en el contrato es la ciudad de San Antonio, donde la clasificación de riesgo de la ciudad de San Antonio por Moody's o por S&P es de A. Entonces, ese contrato nos lleva a un rendimiento de flujo de aproximadamente de 9 a 11% al año, con una tira aproximada de entre 12 a 14% al año. Comparativamente hablando con comprar un bono de la ciudad de San Antonio a 30 años, que nos está pagando a lo mejor 3 a 3,5%. Entonces, la diferencia es 14% de TIR con un flujo de 9 a 11 versus un bono que te paga 3, en donde tienes las tres cosas. Somos dueños del acueducto, es un insumo que no puedes vivir sin el agua, el contrato está escalonado a la inflación, entonces suben los flujos como sube la inflación, y logramos ahora sí que en esa situación y en ese ejemplo matar tres pájaros de una sola pedrada. Y así existen otras oportunidades.
Ahora, quisiera yo hablar un poco, and I'm sure Caroline, I don't know if you have been able to get a little bit of what Jaime was saying, but he mentioned that in the family office's practice and investments, when they come to the U.S. to invest, there are several considerations, and one of these, even higher than the financial considerations, are the legal and the fiscal, or the tax obligation considerations. So we have here Caroline on the legal side y Nora en el punto de vista de los impuestos, sobre todo desde el punto de vista mexicano. So I would like to go first to Caroline and ask her, on the legal side, what is like your checklist or your considerations in this point from what they've been mentioning with either family offices or investments from foreign nationals into the U.S.?
Sure, that's a great question. So with respect to legal compliance, my practice is centered around immigration. So typically we represent companies and or the owners of the companies in their sponsorship for visas in the United States, as well as permanent residents in the United States. So with respect to immigration compliance, what's important to note is that if you have someone who's going to be spending a significant amount of time physically in the United States, setting up these investments and potentially working for you're a company that's been incorporated in the U.S., you really need to consider how much time you're spending in the U.S. and what the nature of those activities is. So with respect to the nature of the activities, if what you're doing at some point really blends over into performing what we call productive work on behalf of a U.S. company that has been incorporated, then typically you would need some sort of a work permit for that. And so I think in a lot of these circumstances where you may also be an investor, perhaps the majority investor in some sort of U.S. entity, then the type of visa we would typically be looking at is this visa known as an E-visa. And the E-visa category is based on the United States and, for instance, in this scenario, a Mexican national. The United States and several countries around the world have set up treaties to facilitate this E-visa, which is intended for use by investors in the U.S. So the U.S. and Mexico, for instance, have a treaty that covers this E-visa category. And so if an individual or whoever it may be is investing a significant amount of money as the majority owner of a U.S. enterprise and can show all of these other requirements listed, including showing that you're going to be developing and directing the investment enterprise in the U.S., that you have at least 50% ownership of this enterprise, that you have operational control, and that you are that there's a substantial amount of capital that you're investing in the United States, typically you would qualify for this E-visa. And then once you have the E-visa, you're able to live physically in the United States and perform work on behalf of this company.
Okay.
So until that point, we always say, hey, until you've secured that E-visa. So the tricky part is you obviously have to incorporate in the U.S. You have to get everything set up. You have to invest the money first. And then you hit all of these checkpoints for being able to even apply for the E-visa with the U.S. consulate in Mexico, and then to be able to get that visa to re-enter the United States to perform work. So it's important that up until that point, whatever you're doing in the U.S. to set up the enterprise is not really what we would call productive work on behalf of the U.S. entity. So that's very much a gray area with a lot of words, but that's something where we would want to discuss, hey, are your meetings into the U.S. or are your trips to the U.S. really just going to be these really short-term meetings where you're just maybe networking and not really, selling this product, for instance, on behalf of the company? Now, if you're not actually doing work on behalf of that company, then I think it's a little bit easier to say, hey, I may not need the E-visa right now. I'm really just doing the investment at this time. The other thing to know with respect to this E-visa is that this visa is intended to be a temporary visa. It's what we call non-immigrant, meaning that it does not lead directly into the permanent residence process. So if your end goal is to actually relocate to the United States permanently and become a lawful permanent resident, or what we would call a green card holder in the U.S., that is a separate process. And I think for a lot of the investors, the process they would be looking at is known as the EB-5 process. And that is a specific green card category that is intended for investors who are putting a very, very high amount of capital into projects in the U.S. I believe the threshold for that is, depending on whether this project is in a really economically depressed area or not, it's anywhere at this point from $900,000 to, I think, $1.8 million. Mm-hmm. And so that's a separate process that would have to be discussed.
Now, just a quick question, a couple of questions. First, these visas have not been affected by the recent, changes by the White House, right? That the administration has been mentioning that they're limiting certain kind of visas and immigration and all that. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of confusion that they will affect all the visas. And I just want to ask you, what is the status of all these?
That is a good question. So with respect to the E-visa, which is that temporary work permit visa that I talked about earlier, that has not been impacted by the White House's recent announcement. So their most recent proclamation from June 22nd talks about suspending certain types of visas, including the H-1B visa, which is a visa for professional workers. Commonly, for instance, if you work as an engineer for Google or Facebook, you might be on this H-1B visa. So that proclamation suspended the H-1B visas, the L-1 L1 visa, which is a visa for someone who works for a multinational company. So for instance, if I'm an executive of a company that has branches in the United States and Mexico, I might hold this L visa. That's been suspended, but there was a carve out, I think, intended for chief executive officers. You know, there's a carve out that says, hey, if you're like really important to furthering the U.S. economy, then you might be able to still get this visa and come over. So those visas were touched by the proclamation. The e-visa, the nice thing about that is that it was not touched. Another visa that is available to Mexican nationals is the TN visa, and that also was not touched by that recent proclamation. And the TN visa is based on what was formerly known as NAFTA, which is now the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and that grants work authorization to a certain list of professions. And so, for instance, let's say you will be working as, an engineering manager in a company in the United States, and you have at least a bachelor's degree in engineering, you would be eligible for this TN visa. The White House has not suspended that visa. So that is an option that's still available.
All right. Now, let's go to the fiscal tax-related thing. Y ahora con Nora, hablar un poco, esa parte para los empresarios y los inversionistas mexicanos es muy importante, siento yo, porque hay mucha gente que ha mencionado o sabe que aquí en los Estados Unidos las cosas son quizá un poco más fáciles de entender. Tal vez me estoy equivocando en esa acepción, pero la ley en México, la ley fiscal se modifica y es un poco quizá más complicada. Desde tu punto de vista, Nora, ¿cuál sería así un primer checklist de personas que quieren hacer inversiones para acá y que están buscando la manera de hacerlo y la mejor manera de, como dijo Jaime, no meterse en problemas, ¿no? Antes de tratar de hacer algo, es por lo menos no meterte en algún problema. Tienes que conectar tu micrófono. Eso, ahora sí.
Sorry. Bueno, antes que nada, muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Espero que pues todos y todas se encuentren muy bien ante estas situaciones pues muy retadoras, ¿no? Y bueno, pues sí, como se comentaba, cuando se piensa pues invertir tu dinero en otros territorios diferentes, por ejemplo en Estados Unidos, como comentaba pues Jaime, es muy importante ver la parte fiscal y también pues determinar, como decía Caroline, cuál va a ser la situación pues migratoria o cuál va a ser la situación fiscal que la persona va a tener pues para de cierta manera cómo se determina el pago de los impuestos. Creo que yo algo por lo que empezaría sería justamente determinar pues la residencia fiscal de la persona que piensa invertir en el extranjero, ¿no? Es decir, si estamos pensando de una persona que es mexicana, que vive en México y siempre ha hecho su vida en México y no piensa moverse a Estados Unidos, pues entonces aquí esta persona física pues mantendría su residencia fiscal en México y esto lo que significaría es que pues tendría que reportar no solamente los ingresos que perciba en México, sino cualquier ingreso que perciba a base mundial. Estamos en México bajo un régimen que no es territorial, sino básicamente es worldwide income, ¿no? Entonces, un punto importante es no pensar que por el hecho de que tenga yo inversiones en el extranjero y que me pague un banco extranjero o un partnership en el extranjero ingresos, pues eso no necesariamente implica que no tenga que pagar impuestos, ¿no? Entonces, el primer hecho es, pues sí tendría yo que pagar impuestos y obviamente, pues por temas de la misma ley en México, por temas de tratados que existen para disminuir la doble tributación, pues en el caso de que se paguen impuestos pues en Estados Unidos sobre esos mismos ingresos, pues se podría disminuir la carga pues tributaria en México, ¿no? Si al final ya la persona pues decide pues moverse a Estados Unidos, en donde pues tal vez necesite las visas que Caroline mencionaba, pues aquí deberíamos de analizar si la persona de nacionalidad mexicana pues pierde o no la residencia fiscal al adquirir la residencia fiscal en Estados Unidos. Si esto sucediera, pues entonces aquí podríamos decir que la persona al ser residente para efectos fiscales en Estados Unidos dejaría de ser residente fiscal en México y al ya no ser residente fiscal en México, pues nada más tendría que pagar impuestos sobre ingresos de fuente de riqueza mexicana. Es decir, cualquier rendimiento que se genere por las inversiones en Estados Unidos no tendrían que pagar impuestos en México. Entonces yo creo que esa es el primer punto o el primer paso que deberíamos de ver para ver cómo va a tributar pues la persona física, ¿no? Y pues ya una vez determinando ese tema, pues es pues definir cómo se va a invertir y en qué se va a invertir, ¿no? En el extranjero, y aquí yo creo que pudiera haber pues dos vertientes, y creo que es importante comentarlas porque dependerá de cómo inviertes y dónde inviertes, de cómo sería tu situación fiscal en México, ¿no? Entonces, atendiendo que la persona sea pues residente para efectos fiscales en México, puede haber, yo creo que dos formas. Uno es que la persona física como tal diga, oye, quiero invertir en el extranjero, tengo este dinero y pues puedo abrir tal vez una cuenta bancaria o un portafolio de inversión en Estados Unidos. Eso digamos que es una inversión pues directa, no utilizamos ninguna empresa o mecanismo como para invertir, sino yo directamente voy y abro una cuenta bancaria, ¿no? Entonces aquí la parte importante es pues analizar efectivamente qué es lo que está dentro de ese portafolio de inversión, porque dependerá si es renta fija, si es renta variable o de qué es lo que tengamos en el portafolio, es cómo se van a pagar impuestos en México, ¿no? Recordaremos que pues el tema de efectivo y de tema de renta fija, por ejemplo, pues si yo invierto en tema de bonos, que pues generalmente la renta fija me genera un interés, habría que recordar que en México no solamente el interés es gravable, sino también es gravable la diferencia cambiaria que pudiera haber en la inversión. Y para poner un ejemplo muy sencillo, si yo tengo una inversión de $100 pues en una cuenta de cash o en renta fija en Estados Unidos y el tipo de cambio a principio de año es 20, mantengo esos mismos $100 durante todo el periodo hasta el 31 de diciembre y el tipo de cambio es de 20 pasó a 24, esa diferencia de 4 puntos, es decir, $400 serían grabados en México. Entonces es muy importante considerar que la renta fija pues tiene ahí un componente de ganancia pérdida cambiaria, o pues analizar qué tanto sería en tema de renta variable, que básicamente lo que te genera ahí es un tema de dividendos o pues un ingreso por la simplemente venta de las acciones, ¿no? Entonces ahí lo único nada más es sí importante como saber qué es lo que trae, como yo le digo, qué es lo que trae en la panza ese fondo de inversión como para poder determinar cuáles son las implicaciones fiscales, ¿no?
Muy bien.
Y adentrarnos, creo, perdón,
No, termina para que podamos continuar. Hay dos preguntas que hay que hacer.
Perfecto. Y bueno, la otra forma es que ya la persona física como tal pues invierta mediante vehículos más estructurados, ¿no? Es decir, mediante la participación como accionista en un negocio, o sea, en un partnership, o el tema de la creación, ya adentrándonos un poquito en el tema de family office, de la creación de un family office en Estados Unidos, la cual pues generalmente lo que hemos visto con nuestros clientes es que generalmente se hace creando una LLP, ¿no? O en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Entonces, aquí sí es súper importante, pues sí estar acompañados de un asesor, aparte del asesor legal, ¿no? Del asesor financiero que te va a decir qué es lo que te da más rendimiento. Sí es muy importante estar acompañado de ese asesor fiscal para, pues, de cierta manera, pues, definir cómo se deberían de pagar impuestos en México. Con todo el tema de los cambios, pues en las regulaciones y sobre todo por la reforma fiscal que acabamos de tener, aquí la realidad es que pues México pues busca, y yo creo que todas las haciendas del mundo, ¿no? Buscan el tema de recaudación, pero bueno, primero aquí sería definir en dónde realmente se está dando la administración principal de ese negocio o de ese family office que tienes en Estados Unidos, ya que si es en México, pues se podría considerar que esa family office tendría residencia fiscal como persona moral en México y por lo tanto tendría que tributar como cualquier empresa mexicana, ¿no? Si al final en base al análisis que en muchas ocasiones hemos hecho con nuestros clientes, se puede determinar que realmente no hay la administración del negocio como tal en México, sino que se permanece en Estados Unidos, atendiendo pues a los cambios recientes en la ley del impuesto sobre la renta con los artículos 4A y 4B que ya son muy famosos. Al considerarse este partnership o este family office una entidad extranjera transparente para efectos fiscales en México, la persona física pues sí tendría que reportar la utilidad de dicho partnership, es decir, no tendría que reportar nada más lo que ese partnership ya después le distribuya como un dividendo, sino aquí los cambios en la ley básicamente lo que te dicen es, tú como persona física tendrías que reportar la utilidad del negocio calculado como si fuera una persona moral, es decir, ingreso menos deducciones, utilidad o pérdida fiscal, y obviamente tributar en base a la participación que tú tengas dentro de ese family office o dentro de ese partnership, ¿no?
Okay.
Antes lo que te permitía la ley es que nada más repartir, si no tenías tú el control del negocio, pues nada más podías tú, de cierta manera, reportar los dividendos, ¿no? Pero aquí lo que te dice es no, o sea, tienes que reportar a nivel ya utilidad. Obviamente, pues, si se echan una lectura del 4 y 4B, lo acaban de leer en 10 minutos, porque son realmente artículos muy pequeños, pero sí está bastante complejo y pues realmente ahorita la autoridad no ha sacado realmente pues algunas reglas, ¿no? Porque creo que sí son necesarias muchas reglas para determinar pues bien cómo se va a hacer esto, cómo se va a tributar, pues para darle más claridad también obviamente a los contribuyentes y bueno, obviamente pues a los clientes pues, que realmente manejamos, ¿no?
Claro. Okay. Gracias. Ahora, I would like to turn back to English because we have a couple of questions that I would like to introduce. So, Jimena, please go ahead.
Gracias, Nora. So one of our first questions is, due to López Obrador's policies, are you expecting to have more investments in the U.S. for Mexicans?
Whoever wants to answer this.
I'm going to take it if you want. And I'm going to do it in English, but it could be in Spanish. I think that López Obrador has shown to the world not a lot of interest in attracting investment from the US to Mexico, and it has scared a lot of people away. You know, what happened in Mexicali with Constellation, what started to happen with clean energy with CENER. So when you are playing a bowling game and they tell you that in the 7th frame, they will tell you who wins, who scored more or who scored less, when the rules are not clear, you don't want to invest money. I think that a lot of wealthy and savvy Mexican investors are taking their time investing again in Mexico and are looking for a place with more rule of law. The US has a lot of problems. You might not or not like President Trump, but at the end of the day, the institutions work. And you know that the set of rules on which you are investing are going to be there today, tomorrow, and later on. So I think it's a wise diversification for an investor to spread out his risk. And I think that we'll see more and more wealthy Mexicans investing in the US. A very important thing here is just adding to what something Jaime said. You have to think of risk-adjusted returns. When somebody tells you, my money made me 8%, it doesn't say anything. 8% might be a lot if he was very, very safe, and it might be a horrible return if he was very risky. So at the end of the day, and this is one of the main reasons to have a family office, so people can put together risk and return and say, for the risk you are taking, the return is sufficient. So I think that, I mean, we are seeing it, Jorge, the approach from our clients to looking for businesses and looking for investments here has doubled in the last 6 months, at least.
Wow. Jaime, ¿tú tienes alguna apreciación de esta pregunta o pasamos a la siguiente pregunta?
No, la verdad es que no tengo mucho que agregar de valor.
Okay.
Yo creo que lo único que te diría es, hay un incremento de capital entrando al país, a Estados Unidos, que proviene de México, como no se ha visto desde López Portillo.
Jimena, siguiente pregunta.
Sí, respecto a lo que mencionaba Nora hace rato, es más importante ahora con COVID el considerar, perdón, se me fue. ¿Es más importante ahora con COVID el considerar el tipo de inversión en caso de que haya algún inversionista que fallezca y su implicación de impuesto, herencias?
Sí, o sea, creo que al final, ahorita, para efectos fiscales mexicanos, las herencias y los legados están exentos. Entonces, ahorita la realidad de las cosas es que no es un tema, se ha discutido en varios tiempos atrás en tratar de grabar las herencias, pero pues sí, creo que al final lo que sí es muy importante es cómo planeas ese tema de sucesión testamentaria en todo el tema de creación de families offices, que pues básicamente uno de los objetivos es este, ¿no? Entonces, pues sí, hay que cuidarlo. Ahorita, pues de cierta manera está exento, pero bueno, quién sabe cuánto nos pudiera durar este tema, ¿no?
Jimena,
Luis.
yo quiero agregar algo ahí.
Sí.
Definitivamente con gente como Nora vas a encontrar la manera de que los impuestos sean mucho menos relevantes si estás bien asesorado. Hay estructuras de todo tipo para inversiones activas o pasivas que minimizan la carga fiscal en forma legal. Entonces, muchos gentes de recursos en México dicen, no puedo invertir en Estados Unidos porque los impuestos me van a comer o el día que yo me muera el impuesto de herencia va a ser altísimo, 40%. Si estructuras fideicomisos irrevocables, hay una serie de mecanismos que Nora sabe de ellos más que yo, que definitivamente te permiten minimizar y se vuelve menos relevante el tema fiscal en tu decisión si es que estás debidamente asesorado.
Ok.
Exactamente, ahí es justamente la importancia de estar acompañando de ese asesor fiscal. La realidad es que no existen dos familias idénticas, ¿no? O sea, tu familia no es igual que la mía y lo mismo ocurre con ese tipo de esquemas, ¿no? No existe realmente una estructura única, una receta estándar que permita pues implementarlos para cualquier negocio familiar, pero sí ciertamente hay que analizar, hay que hacer un análisis, sobre todo escuchar mucho a la familia para cuáles son sus objetivos, qué es lo que quiere, ¿no? Cuáles son sus necesidades, como para de cierta manera determinar cuál es la mejor estructura, ¿no?
Sí.
Que se pudiera implementar.
Antes, tenemos otras dos preguntas, pero hay otras preguntas anteriores que tienen que ver un poco con cuando pusieron tanto Luis como Jaime un poco el panorama de inversiones. Yo capté que no solamente había oportunidad ahora de traer dinero, sino según lo que Jaime dijo, que ahora que ha habido siempre desde los últimos años más dinero que oportunidades de inversión. Es un buen momento entonces para empresarios mexicanos para lanzarse con algún tipo de empresa acá, traer su propia inversión y después también buscar coinversionistas de aquí mismo?
Mira, yo te diría que el mercado en Estados Unidos es no competitivo, sino lo que le sigue. Es ultra competitivo. No importa si vendes papitas o estás en el rubro inmobiliario. Entonces, la zanahoria, dado ese comentario, es que el mercado es gigantesco. Entonces, la oportunidad, si eres bueno y eficiente y compites, es infinitamente más grande que casi en cualquier otra parte del mundo. Dado lo que comentó el señor Maisel, lo que te protege es la certidumbre de que legalmente y fiscalmente las reglas del juego son las reglas del juego y van a mantenerse. Siempre es buen momento en Estados Unidos para invertir y crear una empresa. El resultado de ese esfuerzo es el que depende de la capacidad de la persona que lo está haciendo y el equipo al que se quiere rodear para poder tener éxito. Y ahí es donde la diferencia, creo, casi que en cualquier otra parte del mundo, el margen de error en Estados Unidos es muy, muy, muy chico. Entonces, sí es buen momento, nada más tienes que estar consciente de que estás entrando a un mercado muy, muy, muy competitivo, con muchísimo potencial, pero muy competitivo. Es el más competitivo del mundo.
Yo le pondría palomita a lo que acaba de decir Jaime, aunque si yo fuera un inversionista mexicano ahorita para empezar una empresa, no lo haría a la mitad de la pandemia. Ahorita la situación está muy complicada, no sabemos exactamente en qué va a acabar esto, cuánto va a durar, entonces yo no creo que el timing sea el ideal ahorita para empezar. Pero definitivamente, agregando a lo que dijo Jaime, la gente con la que te unas o que contrates va a ser la diferencia entre ser exitoso o no serlo. Y el hecho de alguien que haya sido, que tenía el mejor restaurante de mariscos en Palmas y se vino a ponerlo a San Diego, aquí duró un año y cerró. Entonces, hay que entender el mercado es diferente y hay que rodearse de gente que sepa lo que está haciendo.
Sí. Okay, so I think we're approaching to our 1 hour limit, and we still have some questions, but maybe we should send them to you later. And I understand there's a lot of topics, different topics, but I want to be respectful for your time. You know, an hour passed by like 10 seconds. A very interesting topic, and it seems that has a lot of other many more topics or subtopics to go. But I just want to give the opportunity to each one of you to say something just to wrap up. And let me start with the ladies, and let me start with Caroline, and ask you, I mean, besides the immigration thing, do you see other main things or checkpoints for Mexican investors in the U.S. As your final wrap-up of the conversation?
Sure, that's a great question. So with respect to, in addition to immigration, I think one key point too would be if you're going to be setting up a corporation in the United States, how you are going to incorporate. And all of that, of course, implicates multiple areas, including corporate tax, corporate law, tax law, and then if you're going to have employees, employment law, which is another area that my firm touches on. So all of those areas typically integrate, as well as cross-border implications in terms of how that folds back into your tax implications in all of the respective countries in which you're holding your investments. So with respect to that, all of that area is something that I would be happy to make references to if it's something that my firm would not be able to handle directly. Nora works with KPMG, and Ogletree and KPMG have actually entered recently into an alliance with respect to a lot of global mobility matters. So that's something where we would be happy to provide any sort of reference or advice as we can help.
All right. Thank you, Caroline. Nora, ¿hay alguna otra consideración, además de las que ya dijiste? En México sigue habiendo esa preocupación de que el brazo de Hacienda es largo y es muy agresivo y de repente hay noticias y rumores que ponen a inversionistas nerviosos cuando quieren hacer movimientos. ¿Qué dirías para cerrar tu presentación?
Pues sí, ciertamente, pues las autoridades lo que buscan al final es recaudación. La idea lo que sugeriría, pues sí, acercarse con los especialistas en la materia. Hemos asesorado realmente a varios clientes con estos temas desde la perspectiva fiscal. Entonces, sí, el estar muy acompañado de gente experta que te ayude a ir por el camino para evitarte riesgos, yo creo que es algo muy importante. Y el otro tema creo que también que no dejaría de lado es, pues así como se analiza la parte fiscal en México, analizar las implicaciones fiscales que te pudiera traer también el invertir en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Algo que manejamos mucho y mi especialidad básicamente es en temas de expatriados, o sea, ayudar a las empresas con todo el tema de sus programas de movilidad global. Aquí la realidad, lo que siempre comentamos es, por tratar de tapar o cuidar un país, tal vez estés descobijando al otro país. Entonces, como que sí es muy importante analizar las implicaciones fiscales que todo este tipo de inversiones te puede traer, tanto en tu país en el que vives, como en el país en el que vas a hacer la inversión, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que eso es lo que comentaría.
Gracias, Nora. Gracias por tu participación. Jaime, contigo, ¿algún último comentario? Yo sé que tú tienes mucha experiencia trabajando en esto. Las inversiones de los mexicanos en los Estados Unidos siempre han sido grandes, muchas. La cercanía, que somos vecinos, el hecho de que creo que es algo que siempre ha existido y bueno, ha habido momentos de la historia en las que suben, bajan, como lo decías tú hace rato. Hay administraciones o sexenios que han sido altos, bajos y seguramente va a seguir así, ¿no? En el futuro. Pero ¿cuál sería tu último comentario y visión general sobre este aspecto?
Mira, con la cautela que comentó el señor Maisel, yo lo que diría es, así como decimos en México, a río revuelto oportunidades hay, ¿no? A largo plazo Estados Unidos no va a dejar de ser lo que es hoy. Y lo que para nosotros es muy interesante era muy difícil definir y detonar inversiones que nos daban la convicción de concluir que tenían mérito antes de que sucediera el COVID. Y repito, lo que dice el señor Maisel es muy cierto, no sabemos dónde va a acabar esto, pero basado en la filosofía del mismísimo señor Warren Buffett, te diría que las inversiones que hacemos hoy las estamos haciendo a 10, 15, 20 años y hoy definitivamente los precios están mejor que lo que estaban hace 2 meses. Ahora, que puedan estar abajo de donde están hoy en un mes, un año, muy probablemente, pero no tengo la bola de cristal. Lo que me queda claro es que a largo plazo tengo la oportunidad hoy de colocar capital en oportunidades que no tenía antes. Y nosotros sí pensamos que finalmente esto se resolverá, se llevará tiempo, pero para nosotros el panorama lo vemos lleno de oportunidad y yo creo que es un muy buen momento para estar muy atentos a lo que te brinda el mercado.
Uh-huh. Muy bien. Y Luis, para terminar contigo, con una visión general, tú has tenido mucho éxito durante muchos años porque has sabido ver oportunidades, analizar empresas, meterte en nichos que tal vez otros no se habían metido. Y yo sé que, por ejemplo, hace rato alguien preguntaba, bueno, si tuvieras liquidez ahorita, ¿qué harías? ¿No? ¿Dónde la pones? ¿Cuál sería tu visión final, tu lección final hacia la gente que quiere invertir o aumentar su inversión o invertir por primera vez y buscar estos esquemas?
Mira, déjame contestar en varios niveles. Meterme ahorita a la bolsa se me hace peligroso. Yo sí estoy bastante líquido, esperando una contracción de los mercados para entrar. Lo que dijo Jaime, a largo plazo este país va a seguir creciendo y va a ser exitoso. El punto de entrada es muy importante y de eso depende tu horizonte de tiempo. Tienes que pensar en la liquidez que pudieras tener con tu dinero. Si lo vas a necesitar en un año, no te metas a una inversión de agua en San Antonio que suena extraordinaria que propuso Jaime, porque no es líquida, no la puedes vender cuando tú quieras. Entonces tienes que comprar un instrumento público que se haga líquido inmediatamente. Tienes que pensar si estás invirtiendo para ti o para tus hijos o para tus nietos. O sea, tienes diferente visión y diferente mezcla, composición de tu cartera dependiendo de eso. Mi única recomendación es vean a gente que lo ha hecho ya muchas veces. A mí me encanta pagar por los errores que hizo alguien, no por los éxitos. A mí que no me platiquen todo lo bueno que hicieron. A mí que me platiquen que aprendieron de lo malo que hicieron para que no lo repitan. Entonces, esa curva de aprendizaje que mencionó Jaime, la compras. O sea, el chiste es subirte con alguien que ya lo hizo y le fue bien. Entonces, para que repita lo que hizo que le había ido bien. Entonces, vivimos de regreso en un país de oportunidades, que va a seguir siendo un país de oportunidades, dependiendo en qué nivel te subas al camino, al camión, es qué tan lejos vas a llegar. Pero al final del día vas a caminar en una carretera bien trazada. Entonces, a todo el que está viendo este seminario, este webinar, es un país para sí invertir, tengan cuidado nada más. Hubo una pregunta, decía, ¿le entraría yo con un entrepreneur que perdió su chamba, un muchacho joven en un startup? Casi te digo, es casi muy similar a irme a Las Vegas y jugar, o sea, si le voy a pegar o no. Claro. Todos hemos oído de Page y Brin que hicieron Google, de Elon Musk. En el camino se quedaron 98 que tronaron. Entonces, si vas a meterte a Venture Capital, de regreso, métete con especialistas, que ya no te metas en la primera instancia, métete un poquito más adelante en cosas ya más probadas. O sea, vuelvo, gran mercado, hazlo con cuidado.
Muy bien. Pues bueno, muchísimas gracias. I want to thank you very much, all of you, Caroline, Luis, Jaime, Nora, and of course, Jim that left us before. for this thing. This webinar and these topics, very interesting. Again, thank you. And it's been our pleasure to host you. We will continue with this topic later in this month. And for now, I just want to say, have a great rest of the day. Gracias a todas las personas que entraron a participar. Si alguien está interesada en seguir platicando o contactar a alguno de nuestros panelistas, por favor escríbanos un email, info@latinoleaders.com, y con muchísimo gusto los podemos redirigir. Pues por nuestra parte es todo. Muchas gracias. Y una vez más,
un placer. Gracias
a ti.
Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Que estés muy bien.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you.
Cuídense.
Thank you.
Bye.
Gracias.